Hey, Mark, how are you?
Nice to see you.
Good to see you as well. Late afternoon there in London today, looks like.
Indeed, it is.
Good. Hey, Mark, thanks for being with us this afternoon. We're
Mhm.
glad to be able to speak with you. I'm thankful for the technology that allows us to do this. I want to introduce Mark for those of you who may not know him. A number of you at Covenant Church have met Mark because he was here with us last fall.
It was like an age ago.
Yeah, it does seem like quite a while. It was another universe ago after this COVID crisis. But Mark was with us in the fall and preached for us. Some of you also may have seen him when he was here in 2017, and that's actually how I first met Mark. Mark was offering the preaching lectures at Covenant Seminary back in 2017, and also preached the Reformation Day sermon for Missouri Presbytery, which is where some of you may have first seen him. Mark is the director of the European and Caribbean arms of the Langham Preaching. And Mark trains Christian leaders all over the Caribbean and all over Europe how to preach and teach the Bible. And I had the unique privilege of being with Mark and seeing him in action.
That was my privilege, Chris.
Oh, yes, you're so generous. Had a chance to be with Mark back in January of 2019. He and I went to Turkey together and spent time in Istanbul and Izmir, where Mark led workshops for Christian leaders in both of those cities. Actually, folks came from quite a ways in Turkey to attend those, and I was invited as well to participate in that. And we just had a great experience there, meeting with Christian leaders in Turkey. But I thought it'd be a good opportunity for us to talk with Mark, since we have lots of time on our hands indoors in front of
I'm
our.
not going anywhere, put it that way.
Recently, that's right. Yeah, Mark usually is jet setting all over Europe and the Caribbean, meeting with Christian leaders around the world, but has been grounded because of this crisis. And some of you may have heard the interview that Ryan did with Dr. Richard Winter from Covenant Seminary last week. And Dr. Winter contributed to a book called A Healthy Faith in a time of, let's see, what's the title here?
It's something to do with pandemics or something?
Yeah, Healthy Faith in the Coronavirus Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a book that was edited with different chapters by a number of folks. Dr. Winter authored a chapter, as well as Mark. And Mark wrote a chapter about kind of how we're coping with the coronavirus. Mark, I wonder if you could just tell us, just to start with, how are things there in London? What's it like on the ground? We have a good experience of how things are here in St. Louis, but just kind of curious what your view is there from London.
Well, I think we are in pretty strict lockdown. So we are strongly urged not to leave our homes. All public meetings have been stopped. All shops are closed. So it's only groceries and pharmacies that are open. A few other things are beginning to open a little bit, but it's not really much relaxation. And the statistics for how things are in the UK are pretty bad. In fact, I've just in the last few minutes seen a report saying that our fatalities have topped 26,000.
Wow.
So for a country our size, that's a significant proportion. I think we're almost now equal to Italy's rate. And that puts us, I think, the largest death rate in Europe. And so, and the other thing is that there doesn't seem to be an immediate indication of when the restrictions will be eased. So it's a very peculiar season.
From when we talked earlier, you said that it's kind of 1 hour outside is kind of. That's what right. You can get outside for an hour of exercise. Other than that, they want you back inside. Yeah.
Yep. And so, the police will stop vehicles, say on the highways or whatever, to make sure that people are not. I mean, there was a bit of a thing in the media a couple of weeks ago, people going to their second homes.
Oh.
And that's caused quite a lot of aggro and angst with people. And so they're saying, no, you shouldn't do that. Stay in your house. So both our children are back from university, and they're with us. So that's great. We're having good times with them. We wouldn't normally have.
Yeah.
But it's quite tough on them as well. My son, he's just in his final year, and so he's missing. So the last term of his university degree has been cancelled.
Yeah.
He's going to have to do his finals exams through some. They haven't quite figured it out yet, but it'll be online.
Mm-hmm.
And he's having supervisions by Zoom and stuff. But it's completely changed. So he suddenly found himself having left. Before it's over. He's not been able to say goodbye to loads of people. It's a very odd thing.
Yeah, no sense of closure in many cases.
Right.
You know, folks are feeling that from my daughter too, who's graduating from college, and others who've very sadly lost loved ones, and there's not the opportunity to grieve as we normally do with full funerals and memorial services and so forth. So it is an odd sense in that regard. Mark, you know, you have a unique perspective because your work is pretty international, and you're often in, you know, various cities in Europe or the Caribbean. As you've talked to both your colleagues and associates with Langham around the world, but also Christian leaders throughout Europe and the Caribbean, what's your sense of how things are elsewhere? Can you give us kind of a brief tour of how folks are doing?
I mean, I think one of the weirdest things about all of this is the sense of a common experience. So more or less everybody I'm in touch with, and that includes people, you know, in South America, in India, Indonesia, I was talking to somebody, New Zealand, across Europe. There's this sense in which, you know, across the world, humanity has been united by this weird experience of distancing. So we can't be together, and yet there's a sense in which we really are in the same boat. And I think I read somewhere that half of the world is now under some kind of restriction. Wow. Half the world's population are in lockdown of some description, which is just, well, it's unprecedented. So I think there's a very sort of common experience there. But if you're in places where the infrastructure isn't there, where, you know, like ordering food online or whatever is tricky, then that is really tough. So India, it's a nightmare. And the police have been brutal in parts. You know, they've been beating people who are just basically trying to go and get food. I was speaking to a former student in Uganda, and it's very tough restrictions there. And you know, many parts of Africa, it's a very outdoor society. Yeah. And so if you're stuck in your compound or whatever, it's a very different experience. The one exception seems to be Sweden. So in Europe, that is, they have not had some sort of lockdown measures, but they've allowed people to be out and about on condition that they keep 2 meters or 6 feet apart. So friends there in Sweden, I was talking to one, he just said, well, it's quite surreal. We're hearing about all this stuff going on around the world, but we're carrying on pretty much as normal. We're sort of shaking elbows, but we're not doing anything. Right. You know, we're carrying on. So yeah, there is a sense in which we have all this in common, and churches are facing the same issue. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Even 10 years ago, our experience of this would be very different. I mean, even how you do church without things like Zoom.
Certainly, yeah.
I mean, I don't know what we would do.
Right. It is a great gift. As frustrating as it can be, as incomplete as it is, it would be much different if we didn't have that at all.
Right. I mean, I guess quite a few sort of Luddites who are opposed to all technology are eating their words a little bit at the moment.
That's all right, I guess. Mark, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the chapter that you wrote for this book, A Healthy Faith and the Coronavirus Crisis. I found it interesting that your take on your contribution to this book had to do with imagination. As we talk about, you know, how are we coping with things in the midst of this crisis? Maybe imagination is not the first thing
No.
that pops to mind. I love the way in the opening of that chapter you introduce us to this with a story about Richard Wurmbrand, who was a former communist leader, but was converted to Christ and a Christian pastor, and had he was thrown in prison and had as you jokingly say, extreme social distancing in a communist prison there. But there was, as well as that tremendous challenge, crisis that he had, there was an opportunity there. Tell us a little bit about what happened with Wurmbrand and how that kind of sparked you thinking about imagination a little bit.
So I've always been fascinated by him. I guess many in Covenant will perhaps know of his book, Tortured for Christ. So he was Romanian, put in prison, and spent 14 years behind bars, and 11 of those years were actually in solitary confinement, which, doesn't bear thinking about, really. And he found ways to communicate with people in the other cells by literally, it's the archetype of prison movies or whatever, isn't it? Literally through tapping on the walls. And of course, that had all kinds of devastating effects on him, and some of which he never got over. It wasn't sort of some kind of super spiritual sustenance through it, although he was sustained through it. I think one of the things that struck me was that he developed his own disciplines and routines while he was under solitary. And one of the things he did was to preach a sermon to himself every day. Now, he had the good fortune to have had a remarkable memory. So he'd actually memorized whole swathes of scripture.
Yes.
And so he was able to do little expositions from what he'd memorized and preach to himself. Wow. And some of these, I guess, he recalled subsequently, and then they were published, so you can get them. I think there's one called 100 Prison Meditations and various others. Wow. But I think that not only did it entail some discipline, but it also entailed a sense in which he had to exercise his imagination. And the key aspect of that was to imagine what was really real. Because if you're in a cell, that is, that screams at you as saying, this is the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
Now, we're in lockdown. We can't really go out of our homes for more than an hour. Now, we've got a little garden, so, we can sit out when the sun's shining and stuff. But, I think some people in apartment blocks or whatever, it's really tough.
Sure.
And there's a sense in which, you stare at the four walls, but somehow it's one way to develop resilience and coping, I think, is to exercise our imagination that somehow liberates us from the physical constraints of our four walls.
Yeah.
And so I think this is where, even though the Wurmbrand experience was extreme, even by the sort of standards of the 20th century, that there's a lot to learn from that. It's interesting, we had for Langham, we had our global team meeting on Zoom this morning. There were I think, 9 of us from Bolivia to New Zealand, so all across the time zones, and we took it in turns to do a sort of devotional, and a colleague was looking at one or two of the Psalms from David's time in the desert.
Oh yeah,
and actually how God uses the desert times.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which I don't think it's stretching it too far at all to say, well, this is a desert time, and maybe we need to use it more constructively to learn things, to say, okay, well, even to ask, okay, what might I be able to look back on as something I've gained from this time?
Yeah.
And actually, I think there's a quote from Wurmbrand who says, there were days when we Christians in prison danced for joy. We were never happier.
Yeah.
That the Lord was at work.
Yes. It's interesting the way you framed that a few moments ago, about imagination putting us in touch with what's really real.
Hmm.
I think a lot of times people think about imagination as a fanciful fleeing from reality. I don't want to think about what's in front of me, so I'm going to make up an imaginary world. Say a little bit more about that, about being in touch with what's really real by means of the imagination.
I think that's an entirely fair point. And of course, that can be exactly what imagination gets used for. It's escapism.
Yeah.
And whether it's going to see a Hollywood movie to be escapist, or, you know, getting lost in your favorite novelist or whatever, deliberately to keep reality at arm's length, that you know, that's how it can work. But I think one of the verses I've reflected on is a lot over the years is that little phrase that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians. He says, we live not by sight, but by faith.
Mm.
Now, the interesting thing about that is that I suspect Paul would be happy with us seeing sight there as, if you like, representative of all our physical senses.
Yeah.
So hearing, sight, feel, even taste, or whatever. And you know, when it comes down to the realities of eternity and the realities of the gospel, you know, we're talking about 2,000 years ago. I mean, right. 2,000 years just trips off the tongue, but that's not exactly contemporary.
Yeah.
It's in a very alien world that is unimaginable. I mean, we've seen a few sort of sword and sandals epics that sort of brings it to life a little bit, but it's not our world. And the sense that the gospel is true, even in the midst of a crisis like this one, and in fact, this crisis has not changed the truth of the gospel one iota.
Yeah.
We actually have to say, well, my senses here are not necessarily helping me see reality.
Yeah.
And that requires the imagination. I've got to imagine what is real beyond what appears to be real.
Yeah.
So for Wurmbrandt in prison, he had to keep reminding himself, preaching to himself, that Jesus still is Lord, not the communist apparatchiks.
Right, right. I seem to be circumscribed in this little cell that tells me this is what reality is, but in fact, Jesus is on the throne.
Right, but I look around and you think, well, there's not a lot of evidence today.
Yeah, yeah.
Unless basically my imagination, my worldview, the way I perceive has been shaped by what is revealed.
So your insight here, I think, Mark, is that this time of where our world has been circumscribed for many of us in ways that we didn't invite and maybe are struggling with, also presents an opportunity through use of our imagination, which really becomes an organ of faith that allows us to be in touch with what's really real, the truth of the gospel, and that Jesus is on the throne without denying the things that are right before us.
Exactly.
And that's an opportunity for growth and development and so forth. What are some ways that we can cultivate that imagination and, find that we are getting in touch with the really real? Maybe ways you've used, but or just other ways that that folks are doing that.
In a way, there's actually the answers to that are not in themselves new or innovative.
Right.
Perhaps this kind of distancing or lockdown season is giving people more time, but I found actually I'm having to work as much, if not more, because of just different ways of having to operate. I'm not traveling at all, obviously, but I am trying to keep in touch with people, because I think that's one of the most important aspects of this is to sustain our church relationships and the ones. Well, my job is in a ministry, so I'm wanting to hold on to that because everybody's under the same pressure. But I think the classic disciplines of praying and reading and hearing and somehow meeting, and I suppose one of the things is that we get, I guess, slightly distracted by the word virtual. There is a sense in which this is virtual, but there's also a sense in which we are having a real conversation now. We are relating genuinely and really. And so even if church is being done in a weird sort of online capacity, and, you know, singing hymns is quite odd together or whatever it is, it's not virtual, it's still real. It's just not as good as it can be. Actually, ironically enough, in the same way that in the normal world, without COVID stuff going on, when we meet as a church, that is just a small hint of what it's going to be like in eternity.
Sure,
So
sure.
you look back from eternity and think, well, yeah, that was good, but this is much better. So it's sort of pushing us forward. And I suppose that's one of the things we need to discipline ourselves to doing, is saying, okay, this future is a reality and a certainty. And I need to meditate on that in the way that C.S. Lewis said, you know, it's not escapism to meditate on eternal realities and truths, because ironically that makes you more effective in this world. Interestingly,
one of the things that I think you initiated as a result of the COVID crisis is a little series on your blog that you do pretty much every day called Echoes from Eternity. Tell us a little bit about that, and why it is that you did it, and kind of what you've seen as a result of that.
I set out to do it every day, but I haven't kept up.
I know you haven't made every day.
It's slightly sort of
that out.
I noticed that there are a lot of places where people are sharing, you know, devotional Bible studies and times of prayer and stuff online. I thought that's great. And of course, online churches are doing that. And, you know, we want to encourage people to stick with their local church that they're a member of, rather than sort of floating around all the different things that are online. But I think partly through wanting to stimulate my own imagination, and because there are so many people in history and around today whose particular gift is being able to encapsulate in words experiences that we can relate to but can't necessarily articulate. And so that primarily means the poets, but it's generally, it's sort of wider than that, writers. And so I just thought, you know, maybe for 10 minutes or whatever, I'd just be a bit touchy-feely. And
for those who haven't tuned in, to describe for us exactly what it is that you're doing.
I suppose that would help, wouldn't it? So, I'm taking one, sometimes two poets or authors each time, and just reading one or two poems by that author that seem particularly insightful or provocative or comforting in a way.
I think there's a train coming for you, Mark.
Yeah, it's a regular occurrence. But I'm still not going anywhere.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm just when the weather got a bit better, I was able to sort of, I take the dog for a walk every morning. That's my, you know, escape. And so there's a beautiful park and cemetery down the road. So that's where I walk the dog, and I'll be recording a few in there. Otherwise, it's in my study.
Yeah, very good. Very good. I've enjoyed several of those. So thanks for doing that. Mark, you know, it's very helpful to hear about how we can cope with the challenge of this very unique, unprecedented, really, for, you know, in the last century, this crisis, and how imagination is a great tool to help us cope with those challenges, maybe even turn it into an opportunity for growth. At the same time, you know, I think for some people currently, whether it's they're facing real health concerns or anxiety about health situations. Many people have already experienced a job loss or economic ramifications. My sense is that not only currently, but in the coming weeks and months, even as maybe we start to inch back towards life as, you know, quote unquote normal, my sense is that the shock waves of this are going to continue to go outward, and that even if people were able to hold it together in the initial kind of most intense time, that as things begin to return to normal, that there people may be ambushed a little bit by how this has affected them in ways they didn't realize, because they had to kind of have a tight grip on things. And once things can relax, they realize that maybe some of the trauma that they've been through. You wrote your most recent book. Mark's an author, has written, I guess, about 10 books by my count, I think. And his most recent book, which is very well received, a fantastic book, published with InterVarsity Press, is called When Darkness Seems My Closest Friend, and it narrates Mark's experience with depression, and particularly as a pastor, as a Christian leader, and some of the uniqueness of that. Mark, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the onset of your depression. I have a feeling that there will be folks who are going to experience something similar, or who may be at risk for something like that in the coming days.
Sure. So we had been working in East Africa. I was teaching in a small seminary in Kampala in Uganda. So we were there 4 years. And originally we were expecting to be there, for the duration. And just various things sort of aligned, and it seemed the right thing to come back to the UK. And I got a job at a church in London. But quite soon after coming back, I was just had an afternoon off. I was on my own in an art gallery, and just suddenly had a major panic attack, and it came completely out of the blue. I wasn't prepared for it. Now, of course, looking back now, I can see all kinds of things that were stacking up and that were factors in this. So this was back in 2005. Mm. And that, because it was just so sudden and inexplicable, and I was experiencing kind of tidal waves emotionally that made no sense and didn't seem related to anything. And literally the trigger had been just hearing in the distance a police car, the siren going past the museum, and it was actually quite near where we lived. And so I suddenly became very conscious of sirens, and in central London you hear them all the time, as you do in most big cities around the world. So somehow that was being a trigger, and it was all unpleasant to say the least, but that meant that I had to realize that there's something wrong here, because this is not normal. So to cut a long story short, I ended up being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress as a result of a number of things. I talk a little bit about them in the book, the number of things that happened when we were in Uganda that sort of piled up. And then, I got some good therapy with that for the PTSD, and I was able to work through that. And thankfully, I would guess after about a year, I stopped having the flashbacks and things like that are commonly associated in the sort of panic attacks, but there were underlying issues that, are still with me 15 years later. And I've been on medication since. But I think that it was very destabilizing. And that's when I knew I needed help.
And in your experience, it came on very suddenly. Now, like you said, in hindsight, you could see, I see how things were heading towards this, but it hits you just kind of out of the blue.
Right.
Not prepared for it. And
And I think one of the things since is that I am much more alert to scenarios that are difficult.
Yes.
And that kind of thing, whereas before, obviously, I was completely blind to it. It doesn't surprise me. So
you were more attuned to things and more self-aware in that regard, than you were before. Mark, one of the things that you talk about in the book is the particular challenge of being a pastor, a ministry leader. I guess the assumption is for many folks, well, if you're a pastor, you shouldn't struggle with depression. the reigning assumption for many people. And, I think that even goes even beyond Christian leaders to just Christians, period. What would you say to folks who as they maybe feel the onset of something like that, feel ambushed by a panic attack or revisiting of some trauma, as may happen in the coming months? What would you say to someone who's in that boat and wants to push it off? No, that's I can't be experienced. That's not proper. What would you say to folks like that?
Well, there are obviously very specific practical steps, I think, but there's a bigger, I guess, if you like, underlying perspective that needs to recognize our brokenness and fallenness. And somehow we have a bit of a sort of disconnect, I think, as Christians. We think, okay, so yeah, I've been saved and I'm battling my sin and, I'm getting ready to be with Jesus in heaven, blah, blah, blah. And every day I'm meant to be getting a little bit better.
Yeah.
And unwittingly, whether or not it's explicitly preached or spoken, unwittingly, we somehow assume that if I've got Jesus, it's all going to be fine. And of course, the answer is yes, it is all going to be fine. But that might include quite a long not yet.
Yes.
And unless I have that factored in, then I'm going to be completely disoriented. Because I'm going to think, hang on, I thought Jesus was with me, and so on. And, you read a psalm like Psalm 1 that says, whatever he or she does will prosper if they're planted by streams of living water or whatever it is. You think, but I'm not exactly prospering here. Now, I think the first thing to say simply is, well, you are absolutely not alone.
Yes.
There are multiple examples in Scripture of the greatest saints, both Old and New Covenant saints, who have had profound mental disorientation, if not illness.
Yeah.
The Lord Jesus himself certainly knew mental disorientation. I don't know whether we, to what extent we can describe it in medical or psychological terms. That's always slightly risky. Yeah. But there's no question that whatever was going on for him in Gethsemane was, and I use the word advisedly, hellish.
Yeah.
And utterly isolating and disorientating and confusing for him. And he was desperate not to be alone, and yet they were all asleep. It's, there is something profoundly important about Gethsemane for all those who go through these kinds of seasons, because it's like even he cried out to God, take this away.
Yes.
And that's a prayer I've certainly prayed.
Yeah.
And of course, since the New Testament era, there have been countless saints and divines who've been through the mill with this. So I think, you're not alone. This is, it's not normal, but it's not abnormal either. And with such a cataclysmic thing that is affecting, as we said earlier, half the world is in some kind of lockdown thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is it? 3.5 billion people.
Yeah.
This is massive. It's bound to have all kinds of effects that we have not even thought of.
Sure. Yeah.
And so why do we imagine that we'll just be able to cruise through, and even the strongest of the strong are going to find this very discombobulating?
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
I read today, British Airways is shedding 12,000 jobs. That's a quarter of its workforce.
Wow.
That's just one out of countless stories like this.
You probably pick lots of industries who are in the similar situation. Yeah.
So, all those who, there's one thing that I think is very sort of clear about this. If ever humanity thought that it was resilient and self-sufficient, this is a moment to prove the lie to that.
Yeah. Profoundly humbling in that regard.
Absolutely.
Very good. That's a very helpful word, to know that that you're not alone. It's not a failure of faith. If that is where you find yourself, it's just part of the reality of living in a broken and fallen world. And there are places to find help and support. You talk about one point in your book, finding a friend who's a touchstone of reality, and whether that's just a friend or it turns out to be a counselor or some help with, there's all kinds of things that that help us. I thought you were going to say, buy my book would be the most important thing.
I'm English. I was hoping you'd do that for me.
There we
that's
go.
Actually quite a good book, I've heard.
Yes. Well, it is, and it's.
One of the things I would say is that, you see, the extraordinary thing about the Bible is that it anticipates all of this.
Yes.
It anticipates those seasons when the world looks as though it's collapsing, and perhaps even is.
Yes.
We in the West have had decades of not feeling that.
Right.
Anyone who's lived in Central Europe, whether it's, anywhere from Germany to the Russian border over the last 200 years, has known that basically every couple of decades, the whole world is thrown up in the air.
Yeah.
If you live in one of those countries that are in the middle of the Central European plain, you've been invaded several times and you've changed hands. In the UK, we've not been invaded for 1,000 years. We're safe, we're sorted. The US has not had, land troops on land attacking you. And we have this sense of being completely impregnable. And of course, it's nonsense. It's like the prophet Obadiah, that wonderful little prophet. And he talks about those, thinking you're safe in your eagle's eyries. You're not.
Yeah.
It's helpful to be shaken up like this.
Another fruit of this crisis is just a kind of return to reality and a humbling, a chance, a number of us have been talking about here. This crisis has afforded the opportunity for us to take a little longer look in the mirror than we'd like to. And there are things that we see when we look in the mirror.
Else to look at, is there? Let's face it.
Right.
Once you've done the whole of Netflix, where do you go?
That's right. It's not always the most pleasant to spend that time, but it can be helpful and necessary. And well, Mark, it's been great to talk with you. I always enjoy talking with you, just very selfishly on a personal level. I just enjoy your friendship so much. But I really appreciate as well. I really can't. This is not just a commercial for Mark's book, but I really can't emphasize enough how helpful Mark's book is. One of the great things about the When Darkness Seems My Closest Friend book is the narration of what depression is like. I think you've done a remarkable job of that, and I think it'd be very helpful for folks who are finding that they're having trouble coping with this, whether now or in the coming months. And I really love the perspective of the opportunities that this crisis has created with imagination, and what that gives us the opportunity to connect with the ultimate realities, the truth of the gospel, the lordship of Jesus Christ. And it's a great gift to be able to have those opportunities. So thanks for speaking with us, Mark. Look forward to a time when maybe you can greet a number of us again, face to face.
Well,
you're in St. Louis
in October, but you just never know what's going to happen next.
That's right. Yeah, the next scheduled time's October. We'll see if that happens or not. But if not, then another point in the future, we'll look forward to seeing you. So thanks for speaking with us.
Right.
And I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Okay. Bye-bye.